Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Sustainable Food webinar. It's hosted by the Food Team and Antonia from FJA. I'm Allison.
I'm Reese. Hi, guys.
Hi, I'm Antonia.
Okay, so let's get started. I really love this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. It says, "In this food, I see clearly the presence of the entire universe supporting my existence." And I feel like this quote is really helpful for just being mindful of where our food comes from and all of the work that goes into it. So this illustration kind of shows the different elements that goes into food and sustainable food particularly. So for food to be sustainable, it needs to be ecologically responsible, fair and accessible, local, healthy, and reducing waste. Okay, for ecologically responsible, what exactly does organic mean? So for things to be organic, it needs to be USDA certified organic, means it's grown and processed according to federal guidelines. So this addresses soil quality, pest, weed control, animal raising practices, and additives. And this is really important because of how food affects the environment and the animals and people involved in its practice. So moving forward, because pest and weed control, that can go into the waterways, which affects people and animals negatively. So it's really important to buy organic food to prevent that from happening. Next, local, what does this really mean? So for farmers markets, that's really awesome to support local farmers and buying from food from sources that's about 100 to 200 miles in your area is really great to buy locally. What does whole foods mean? So healthy foods like plant-based diet, so fats and oils, leafy greens, grains, legumes. This is all really important. And to reduce meat and less dairy is also important in your diet. And to avoid processed foods. Buying processed foods, it's really not good for you, especially processed meats. And also reducing processed food means reducing packaging and plastic waste, which moves to our next slide about no waste. So zero waste, you really want to buy in bulk. So these are grains, legumes, all different things. There's bulk sections. And also your vegetables with reduced packaging. So you really want to buy them like in this photograph in stands where they're not like in plastic or in packaging. You can bring, your reusable mesh bags and put them in there and take them. And that's really great. And also repurposing scraps, like you can make broth or all different things, and then composting anything after that. Fair and accessible. So it's really important to buy fair trade, and you can look for that fair trade certificate on items, or you can look up companies and see if they are fair trade. You can call them, visit farms or whatever, just to make sure that it's ethical. And basically fair trade means when producers in developing countries are paid a fair price for their work by companies in developed countries. This is really important, and unfortunately this is not always the case, so it's really, really important to look into this. You can also research food companies to inspect their practices in depth. And now I'm going to hand this over to Antonia to talk about food justice specifically.
Yeah, so whenever we talk about food sustainability, it's really important to also talk about food justice, not only for the specific food that is sustainable, but also who has access to that food. So just to start off with this, I am going to give you a brief overview of the food justice movement in case you haven't been introduced to it before. So the food justice movement is a grassroots initiative emerging from communities in response to food insecurity and economic pressures that prevent access to healthy, nutritious, and culturally appropriate foods. Food justice recognizes the food system as a racial project that emphasizes the influence of race and class on the production, distribution, and consumption of food. This encompasses farm labor work, land disputes, issues of status and class, environmental justice, public politics, and advocacy. So it is all encompassing, not only for the farm workers and the land that the food is grown on, but also the animals, who has access to that food, what effects does it have on our environment. So it sees an overview of justice within food overall. So specifically, food justice and sustainability. Food justice and sustainability are intersectional. You cannot separate them, and you can't have one without the other. So food injustice and sustainability issues both arise from the same history of colonization and slavery. So historically, there's indigenous land practices and indigenous land management that are sustainable and just. And then through colonization and slavery, you have European agriculture, which eventually brings us to today, where we have unsustainable and unjust food practices. So overall, you can't have sustainability without justice, because they are both created through the same issues. And something that I really like is that sustainability and food justice both come down to just asking yourself one question, is where does your food come from? So whenever you grab a granola bar or you have a salad, to evaluate if your food is sustainable and if your food is just, you can simply ask yourself, where does this food come from? So by asking yourself that, you're looking into, okay, where does my food come from? If you're eating a steak, that goes to an animal, but if you are like eating a salad, you can think about the producers that grew your lettuce or your carrots, and every single aspect of that. What land usage, whose land was that? Is it, if it was stolen land, if the land isn't being used well? So that is both sustainability and food justice. Also the conditions of farm workers and animals of that food. What water practices did they use? Do the farm workers have access to bathrooms and breaks and fresh water while they're working? So it all comes down to just asking yourself, where does your food come from? So not only where it's grown, how it's packaged, where it gets shipped to, what stores it's sold in, and it all comes down to sustainable practices and justice.
All right, guys. So when we talk about Rainforest Alliance certification, what are the standards for products that hold this certification? Well, it's a third party that evaluates farmers on their agricultural methods, judging on sustainability, which they say comes down to social, economic, and environmental impacts. So they look to make sure that farmers are using practices that protect against forests, preventing expansion of cropland into forests, making sure that there are practices keeping trees alive, positively impacting the soil, having clean water, and protecting native forests. It's also about avoiding deforestation for new croplands or processing plants that could potentially or will increase greenhouse gas emissions. It's also about advancing rights of rural citizens, so making sure there's no human rights abuse, no child labor, no forced labor. It looks at the working conditions of workers, like Antonia was saying, about providing fair wages to workers, looking for gender inequality and violation of indigenous land rights. And it's also about lifting rural people out of poverty, making sure that there are financial benefits to these farmers. And those are some products at the bottom who have this certification, and there are many more. So make sure you look out for it when you're buying stuff. Next slide. All right, and I'm going to talk about the environmental impacts of meat. So meat is a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of water is used to grow both the animals' food and also to clean them and also to give them water to drink. And according to PETA, it takes more than 2,000 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of meat, while 1 pound of tofu only requires 244 gallons. So by going vegan, one person could save about 219,000 gallons of water a year. There's also issues of factory farm runoff and water contamination, where bacteria and viruses can be carried into the runoff and go into our groundwater. it takes a lot of plants to create a smaller amount of meat. And we could just be using those plants to eat themselves without having the meat as the middleman. And it also takes a large amount of land to produce meat when compared to vegetables. In the US alone, 56 million acres of land are used to grow feed for animals, while only 4 million are used to produce plants that we eat. And also, cows just naturally produce methane, which is another greenhouse gas. And that eventually has a real big effect when you take into account all of the animals that we're using to make meat. And it's also about solving the food crisis. Scientists estimate that for every degree we heat the planet, the yield of cereal crops will decline by about 10%. And our planet cannot sustain these agricultural practices any longer. Climate change will lead to food shortages and malnutrition. And deforestation, desertification, and drought will negatively impact our agricultural areas, making it that we don't have enough food in the future for us. But despite all these things, there are things that we can remember, that we have the power as the consumer. We make big changes with little choices that we make every day. They add up. And just remember to start off small. Everything that you do helps. Every mindful consumption will lead to a greater outcome. And education is key. Just tell people more about these issues, and they're more likely to want to change their food habits and to think about what they're doing every day. So what is mindful consumption? Well, it's thinking about these few questions. Is this food item organic? Where and how was it grown? And how was it packaged? And some small changes that we can make every day is buying in bulk, buying organic or fair trade, buying from local farmers. You can also buy from grocery stores like Natural Grocers and Sprouts. You don't have to have that cognitive load of having to decide what to buy and research what foods to eat, because all of them have already been through that process. It's foods that are sustainable and good for you. And also reduce and eliminate your meat consumption. So now we're opening the floor to any questions that you guys might have.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box below. The first question is, how do you engage in mindful consumption when you're at the grocery store?
I'll start. So I'm still completely social distancing, quarantining, whatever you want to call it. So I do all my grocery shopping online, which can give a new opportunity to be mindful because, I have all week to look at my cart and add or subtract. And one of the biggest things that I have been looking at with that is where I'm getting my food and how I can get it curbside or delivered. So previously I would use my own reusable tote bags, or if I didn't have them, I would just carry all my food. I wouldn't use bags. And with curbside and pickup, it was just terrible. One time I got my groceries delivered and they put them in these cooler bags, and the plastic bags were inside the cooler bags, and then inside the plastic bags, each the fruit and veggies were in their own plastic bag, and it was just very overwhelming how much waste it was. So I started to really look into how I could safely get my groceries sustainable, and I actually found Aldi, which is about 20 minutes away from where I am, which is its own thing, but they have they put all their food in paper bags. And I asked one time if HEB curbside could do that as well, and they did it too. So I think just being intentional about that and looking if I can't use my own reusable bags, what I can do. And so not only the food purchasing itself, but what it's in whenever I'm getting it was a big thing for me. But then also, yeah, so I think that's the biggest way that I think about it right now.
That's a really good point. It's difficult even more right now with having to buy curbside, because it's so often that everything is thrown in plastic bags because that's more sanitary or whatever. So not only do you have to consider are my potatoes already in plastic packaging and then they're put in a plastic bag, you know, because you can buy in bulk with like your mesh bags whenever you go to the grocery store, but how does that work whenever you're buying curbside? So I guess, Antonia, just like what you were saying, is looking into these places that you're buying from and just doing research and finding out what is the most sustainable option for grocery shopping is really important.
Yeah, I buy most of my groceries at natural grocers just because I know who it's coming from, that all the products are really good and sustainable most of the time. If not, I try to look online and do some research about different companies if I'm thinking about trying something new. And I usually try to stick to more whole like plants and stuff like that, stuff I know was grown locally. And even if you were to find like some packaged stuff that is too, you might not know exactly how it was produced, who like the labor that was put into it. And so I think that helps. Definitely just educating yourself on these brands and these companies can make a really big impact.
What are the best strategies for talking to people about shifting to plant-based or sustainable diets without judgment?
So as I talked about with the just asking yourself, where does your food come from? I think that's a really good place to start off with. But specifically with food justice, I think coming to an understanding that yes, our individual choices do make sense, but a lot of the pressure needs to be put on big businesses. And not everybody has access to healthy foods. Not everyone has access to a budget that allows them to shop sustainably and plant-based. So I will say that I think whoever you are talking to, having a basis of understanding of that not everyone has access to it, but small changes that you can make where you can make them are important. So even if you don't go 100% plant-based, small decisions that you make do add up. But I definitely think coming to an understanding that it's not all individual blame and no one should feel ashamed of getting the food that they can access within their budget or where they are or anything like that.
I agree. There's definitely a privilege that goes along with being able to buy more plant-based stuff, especially things that are more expensive, and just being able to go to a grocery store like down the road or maybe to a farmer's market that isn't close to you. Some people don't have that option. So you definitely should not try to put blame on anyone in any way, and just kind of maybe give them tips or something that they can try. Like maybe when they go to the grocery store, use a reusable bag. Like that's a simple way that they are trying to be more sustainable. And they're just, yeah, just stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think also with regard to if people are wanting to change their meat consumption instead of being really judgmental, or if someone's not really wanting to totally cut out meat, maybe just talk about reducing the amount that they eat, like maybe not having, 5 or 6 servings a week, maybe have like 1 or 2, instead of saying, oh, you shouldn't be eating meat, you're a terrible person, and just say like, please eat less, like at least start somewhere. So yeah, I think any conversation being judgmental isn't going to change anything. So just keeping that in mind is really helpful when having these conversations.
I'm going to combine 2 questions since they're very similar. Do you have any recommendations on where to buy less expensive organic products in Georgetown? I really like natural grocers, but it is very expensive, so I cannot commit myself to buying all my groceries from there. Another question was, organic foods tend to cost more than processed foods. Any suggestions on how to shop mindfully on a budget? So very similar. How do you buy organic without breaking your wallet?
So I mentioned Aldi. Apparently, an Aldi is being built in Georgetown and should be here in the next few years, but it's not right now. So there is an Aldi. The closest one that I know of is in Pflugerville. And from Georgetown around campus, it only takes me 20 minutes to get there, which is not sustainable for every single week. So I typically do try to get groceries every 2 weeks. And so I'm only going over there once every 2 weeks. And as I said, I'm social distancing, so it's the only time I use my car, so I feel like it makes up for it. But I do feel like there is a lot of cheap organic produce and prepackaged foods there. that cost less than natural grocers, Sprouts, or I'm trying to think of other health food stores we have near here, and I think those are the main two. But then also HEB. I've noticed that HEB has a lot of good options for organic produce, and even local produce that I've noticed for relatively cheap, a lot cheaper than natural grocers. I love natural grocers, but there is a higher markup there, even on like Guardian prepackaged foods, which makes sense with the facilities it cost. And then to answer the question about organic foods tend to cost more than processed foods, any suggestions how to shop mindfully? Something that I've noticed is like there's a lot of greenwashing. And so just looking at like the brand itself with prepackaged foods and then trying to do more plant-based. So with vegetables and those things, they typically do cost less than prepackaged foods. So going whenever you are trying to eat more organic, looking at plant-based, but then also with processed foods, either way, even if it says organic, if it's from a company like Nestle, it may not be worth it to spend more money on it at all. And there's just, I feel like there is a ton of greenwashing within that. Yeah, and then I feel like another really good option that isn't necessarily always talked about is I feel like Asian markets have a ton of gems. Diamonds in the rough. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I feel like Asian markets are always overlooked and have a ton of really cheap, good options for plant-based foods or organic foods. And so I think that is somewhere that you can look. I think there's an H Mart near Cedar Park, and then I think there is another, I think it's called Indopac in Round Rock. There might be some more, but those are the main two that I've been to, and they have a ton of options for that.
Those are all really good suggestions. My suggestion would be HEB too. Again, you just have to look at the brands and what they stand for and where the food comes from. You can always buy vegetables, and that is plant-based, so there's always that option too.
I was going to say, I'm a really big fan of Fiesta. It is a fabulous grocery store, has a lot of different cultural type foods, and is often a lot cheaper than your traditional grocery stores. I used to shop there all the time in Houston, and I believe there's one in North Austin as well. So it's a little bit of a trek to get to, but it'll change your world. Now, let's see what other questions we have. Are there any resources to find local farms throughout the country? I live in a city, and I'm not sure if there are any local farm markets. Y'all are doing great, by the way.
I think just getting plugged in with your community is a really good resource. For that, I'm trying to, oh gosh, I work with nonprofits, so I was thinking about like the Sparrow Farm, but I don't know if they have any food. But I think like Facebook pages, so I know there's like the Georgetown, Texas Facebook page. People regularly put in questions like that, and there just be tons and tons of comments of people just saying like their family businesses and things like that. So I think just like looking for resources in the community wherever you are and just asking the community. There'll be random things. I know I work for a family taking care of their daughter typically before COVID, and they have a honey farm. And so I would have never known that unless I knew them and talked to them. So I think just looking for how to get plugged in with your community, finding those. If you find one farmer's market, just ask them, and they probably know all the local farms.
Yeah, I think the best resource would just be using the internet or social media and stuff like that. You can definitely find a bunch of stuff that way. I'm also from a big city, so I didn't really know of any like local farms, especially not here in Georgetown. But then I remember one day I went to Wolf Ranch and I saw the farmers market there. I was like, oh, that's super cool. And then I started looking at online at different ones that are near. There's also one in the square, and there's a farmers market in Sun City, which is a little farther away, but
Yeah, and I think also just asking your local grocery stores, like if they source their produce and their vegetables and fruits from local farmers and just raising those questions, because some of them do. Like I know, I think Sprouts does, and I think natural grocers are locally centered. So just asking where you normally get your groceries, if they do source locally grown food, would be helpful also.
So with regards to food justice, is there a third party certifying any companies? Are there a list of companies that take this into consideration? The Rainforest Alliance sounds great for that industry.
I think looking at what's kind of going on again in the community. So I know that the United Farm Workers Union is a really good place where people typically have boycotts on companies or spotlights on workers that are in companies that are paying them living wages. And so looking at local unions, I guess you Texas Farm Workers as well. And so I think that's a good place to start. I don't think it necessarily has to be the Rainforest Alliance or things like that. There are a lot of questionable companies that do get those certifications. So I think definitely looking into that as well. But I definitely do think following like the United Farm Workers on Twitter or Instagram, they regularly will post photographs shared by farm workers and stories, good or bad. So in their big brands like Driscoll's, big brands, not brands, like Driscoll's and things like that, that you can find in any grocery store. And so I think just being aware of that, and while you're scrolling on Twitter and Instagram, seeing that on there regularly kind of also makes you think about it more often. So I think that's a really good.
Yeah, I would recommend looking for a certified B Corp. So B corporations are companies that have gone through very rigorous standards for social equality, environmental practices, and responsible governance structures. It's a very rigorous certification and is quite hard to achieve. So whenever you see a certified B Corp label on, you know that that company has at least an 80 on the B impact assessment, which means that they are a fairly responsible company. That's not a very well-known certification, though it is getting traction as more and more companies are, going above and beyond trying to get that certification. The next question is, do you have any suggestions for reading or documentaries about sustainable eating or farming?
There's one, I think it's on Hulu right now, called the Biggest Little Farm, or maybe Our Biggest Little Farm, and that it's a documentary, and it's really wonderful. It just kind of shows all of the elements that goes into ethically farming, and everything, the struggles with that, but also the benefits of it, to be ethical and healthy. And I highly recommend that one. That's a really great one. Also, Game Changers is a really good one, specifically looking at meat. And yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest the Game Changers too, because we had a panel about it yesterday. But also, Cowspiracy is a good one. Yeah, it just looks at the meat industry and all the things around it. Some of the things that we talked about.
I do not have any specific recommendations, but I do have words of wisdom. Look up the documentary beforehand, if you, just to be sure, because a lot of them show very graphic images. If they're more based on meat, not sustainability, and sometimes it's just a lot. I don't know if it's necessary to learn, but I feel like it's important. To be aware of, but sometimes it's a lot to see inside of meatpacking facilities and things like that. So yeah, like don't just go watch Earthlings on YouTube without looking up beforehand. Like definitely be aware of what you're gonna watch, unless you are just ready.
Yeah, one I would recommend, but Antonia, what you're saying, like with warning, is Food Inc. Yeah, I think is a really important film, and it looks into the meat industry. But some of it is a bit graphic, although I do think it's important to know about how animals are treated in the meat industry. It's very bad. So it's important to know that, but maybe you can fast forward some of those parts. But that's also another very, very good documentary.
Yeah, I would second Cowspiracy. That one goes heavy more so into the environmental aspects of the animal agriculture industry. And I don't remember anything graphic in that one, so it should be safe to watch. But if there is a graphic scene, I apologize, I don't remember it. I think that's all the questions, unless anyone had any last minute ones. I guess, do you have any like final little words of wisdom, specifically for the college students watching, trying to eat sustainably while as a college student?
I think just preparing is a really big thing. I feel like as a college student, it can be really easy to just be like, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna grab something from a grocery store, fast food place. I'm just gonna, get some. And sometimes that's necessary, but I think just preparing your meals for the week and just writing down like, okay, this is what I'm vaguely gonna eat for lunches. So I'm vaguely gonna eat for dinner someday. It doesn't have to be like a full blown like meal plan, but just kind of knowing really helps, but also helps a ton with food waste. And sometimes whenever, you first start cooking for yourself, it can be difficult to know, how much leftovers you're going to have. And yes, but I feel like having some kind of plan really helps with not wasting a ton of food. Whether or not you just don't get to it or you make it and you're like, I'm tired of eating spaghetti for the third day in a row, I'm throwing this away. So I think just like planning and learning helps a ton.
Yeah, and I think just being mindful of the food that you're buying, like instead of just saying, oh, I need potatoes, I'm going to grab them in this package, like, oh, actually, I don't want them in all of this plastic. So buying similar food that you buy, but just being mindful of where it comes from is important. So that way, you can get through the work of that kind of cognitive load that's happening while you're at the store, but then you don't have to make so many decisions when you're at home, because you've already bought the healthy food and the ethical food. And just like if you're in the Commons or wherever you are, just think about the food. And I know the Commons isn't perfect, but just thinking about the kind of food that you want to consume and whether or not it's ethical. So just being mindful and taking inventory of the kind of food that you normally eat and what little changes you can make. Because no one is perfect and we're not just going to be like these perfect consumers. So just making little changes. If you don't want to get rid of meat out of your diet, just reduce the amount of meat that you have and just start with that. And just doing some research and taking inventory and what little changes you can make in your life.
Yeah, it's definitely hard with the commons or if you're stuck on campus. But I think just remembering why you're doing it in the first place, like thinking about the workers and how everything is grown and the impact it has on the environment is really helpful to make sure that you stay on track and kind of actually go the extra mile to figure out what exactly you're eating.
And I'm just going to make a little shameless plug for the SU Garden. We do have an on-campus garden and greenhouse, and the SU Garden Club is an excellent resource of learning how to grow your own food. So then that way you know exactly how it was made and how you were treated making the food. I have recently picked up learning how to make my own food. I have successfully grown one tomato during quarantine. It is fulfilling, and then it gives you also a greater appreciation for the actual farmers who do put in the work to make food for the entire nation and for the world. It's not as easy as you think it would be. With that, is there, oh, go ahead.
I have just one small thing. If you wanted to read more about how we can't separate justice and sustainability, I have a small blog post, not that I wrote, that was written that I read. And so if you wanted to read more about that, I'm going to put that link in the chat.
Great. And I'll include that link in the YouTube description. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to send it to friends if you feel like they should know this type of information. I think we can wrap up. All right.
Thank you guys for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks guys. We enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye.